Special report that we planned to bring you tonight was about domestic politics, the battle among the Democrats. But we think the crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home. Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
Iran hostage crisis.
Whoa. Let's take this back a notch. How did we get here?
In 1953, the U.S. helped overthrow Iran's elected prime minister and replaced him with Mohammad Reza Shah.
The Shah was considered a puppet to the U.S. because of their ties with oil and was often considered a brutal dictator, killing and torturing his own citizens in Iran.
Opposition increased even more when the Shah decided to go on a family vacation in January of 1979, going from country to country.
Following the Shah's vacation in March of 1979, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini took power in Iran. Khomeini established a new government in Islamic Republic. This new government and the people who supported it had no love for the United States. They staged demonstrations outside the U.S. Embassy in the Iranian capital of Tehran.
Soon after being diagnosed with cancer, the Shah wanted to come to the United States to receive the best medical care. President Jimmy Carter didn't want to admit the Shah, but relented under pressure.
After Carter gave the Shah shelter, on November 4th, Iranian students attacked the U.S. Embassy.
United States Marine Corps guards used tear gas to try to disperse the mob of Islamic students. But that wasn't enough. Hundreds of Iranians finally overran the embassy compound, seizing about 90 people, mostly Americans. The hostages, men and women, were blindfolded and herded into the embassy's basement. No casualties were reported. The Iranians burned a United States flag and denounced the U.S. government, saying they would stay until the U.S. sends the deposed Shah back to Iran.
November 17th, the Ayatollah ordered the release of 13 hostages, leaving a total of 53. Another hostage was subsequently released on medical grounds, and from then on, the remaining 52 were there for the long haul. They were held in the same embassy complex where they'd once worked. No hostages were killed, but they weren't treated well and they were tortured.
The hostages were beaten with rubber hoses, hung over elevator shafts, and even blindfolded. The U.S. was able to see this all over news coverage.
The American government demanded that the hostages were released, but the Iranians wanted the Shah shipped to them. The U.S. said no by freezing Iranian assets held in American banks, but still the Iranians didn't budge. In April of 1980, President Carter decided to try something different. He authorized a military rescue mission known as Operation Eagle Claw, but then it failed.
After the operation's failure, the Carter administration was looked at as an embarrassment, which led to him losing against Ronald Reagan in the election of 1981.
By the start of 1981, the Iranian government began to feel the pressure from the international community. To release the hostages, the Iranians and Americans went back to bargaining. In exchange for lifting the embargo, Iran agreed to release their prisoners. Just hours after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office on January 20th, 1981, the hostages were freed from captivity.
January 20th, 1981, a day that began as the 444th day of captivity and ended as the first day of freedom for the American hostages in Iran. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News, reporting from Washington. Good night.
The hostages were flown first to Algeria, where they were greeted by cheering crowds. Then they continued to West Germany, where they would be met by former President Jimmy Carter, who had spent most of his presidency trying to free him.
Did you think the American government was doing enough to help you guys?
So I did not expect that the American government would help me. Way back when I first joined the Foreign Service in 1974, we had briefings and meetings and all of this and orientation that went on for a month. And one of the speakers was the head of the counterterrorism unit. He was a former ambassador, and he was giving us the lecture and about security concerns and terrorism, etc. And what he said was, if you are ever kidnapped, we will not deal with hostage takers. We refuse to deal with them.
Did you think you were going to die there?
I didn't care. I didn't want to think about it, so I didn't think about it very much. I just did it day by day.
Even here
years after the crisis, besides losing all international support in the Iran and Iraq war, Iran failed to get any of the concessions it had demanded of the United States. Today, some of $1.973 billion of Iran's assets remain frozen in the United States, and the U.S. has not imported any of the oil from Iran since 1992. And in 2015, the U.S. Congress created the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund to assist the surviving Iran hostages and their spouses and children. Under the legislation, each hostage received a $4.44 million or $10,000 for each day they were held captive. By 2020, however, only a small percentage of the money had been paid out.